Hello, I'm Matteo, the Chief Mobile Opinionist here at Tech Travel Geeks. And this is the long-awaited Tech Travel Geeks comparison between the iPhone 13 Pro and the iPhone 14 Pro. The iPhone 13 Pro is here on the left, is in a colour called Sierra Blue, which was exclusive in 2021, and the iPhone 14 Pro is on the right and is in Deep Purple, which was a colour exclusive in 2022. Now, we'll go through the comparison of specs side by side. I'll give you my first impressions because I've had the iPhone 14 Pro for less than 24 hours. But when it comes to cameras, battery life and so forth, I won't really be able to make a judgment until I've used it for at least a month. Anyway, let's start off with the dimensions. Now, to most people, they look exactly the same, and they pretty much are. What you can't see probably on camera is that there is just a minor difference in thickness. So the iPhone 13 Pro is slightly slimmer than the iPhone 14 Pro. It's slightly lighter. To give you the exact specs, the iPhone 13 Pro is 146.7 millimeters by 71.5 millimeters, and it's 7.7 millimeters thick. Whereas the iPhone 14 Pro is just slightly thicker, and taller. So it's 147.5 millimeters high, so that's almost a whole millimeter extra in length. It is 71.5 millimeters in width, which is exactly the same, but it is 0.2 millimeters thicker. Now, for most cases, that makes absolutely no difference. You'll be able to use an existing case for an iPhone 13 Pro for the 14 Pro. Unless they're super tight, super slim fitting cases, in that case there will be a difference. And the same goes for skins. In some cases, if you get something like Extreme Skins or D-Brand, there will be some very minor differences there. So in terms of the dimensions, they're very, very similar, but just the iPhone 14 Pro is just slightly bigger. And more importantly, there's an extra couple of grams in weight in the iPhone 14 Pro. In the first few hours of having the two devices, I haven't really noticed a difference, but 2 grams is something. In the space of our drones, for example, 2 grams can be the difference between needing a license to fly your drone and not. But luckily with the iPhone, that's not the case. Anyway, both devices have pretty much the same design. It's a glass front and glass back with, in this case, a stainless steel frame. Now this is where the difference is between the standard iPhone 13 and 14 and the Pros are. It's stainless steel rather than just aluminium, or aluminum if you're of the American persuasion. And that's, I would say, a standout feature for the device. But in terms of everyday use, especially if you have a case on it, it makes no difference. Now, both devices are officially dual SIM devices. What we mean by that is that in the UK, both devices have a physical SIM card slot and the facility to support an eSIM. Now, if you're in the US, on the iPhone 14 Pro, that's not the case. You will only have dual eSIM option. You won't have the physical and eSIM option, which for some people is good, for some people is bad. The jury's still out. But in terms of travel, I personally think that's a limiter in what sort of SIM cards you can choose and what network providers you can choose, especially when traveling. So both devices, with their dual glass setup, their glass sandwich industrial design, are in actual fact IP68 rated. That means they're protected for most splashes in water. They can be submerged occasionally in fresh water. If you do put it in salt water, make sure you rinse out that phone. And in terms of overall body, they're, as we said, very similar. Now, the camera bump on the iPhone 14 Pro is deeper. It's got bigger bumps because the cameras are significantly different. So the iPhone 13 Pro had a 12 megapixel main sensor, 12 megapixel ultra-wide, and a 12 megapixel telephoto lens. It's 3 12 megapixel sensors, whereas the iPhone 14 Pro really does revolutionize and reinvent the camera as far as iPhone's concerned. This is a setup with a 48 megapixel main sensor, a 12 megapixel telephoto sensor, and a 12 megapixel ultra wide. On paper, things look significantly different. We'll need to see in everyday use if that's the case. Now let's move over to the front of the phone. This is, in the case of the iPhone 13 Pro, OLED display, which has, as you can see, a notch at the top. But going by Apple's naming convention, that notch is actually a static island, because with the iPhone 14 Pro, Apple introduced the dynamic island, which is essentially a pill cut out at the top of the screen. Not entirely dissimilar to what we've seen on devices such as Android smartphones. So, notch, static island. In physical terms, they're pretty much the same. Let's focus on the screen just a little bit longer. So, on the iPhone 13 Pro, the one with the notch, you have a 1170 pixel wide screen by 2532. So this is supposed to be a Super Retina XDR OLED display. It does support 120 Hz refresh rate. It does have HDR10 rating, and it goes up to 1200 nits in brightness. And over the course of a year of using the iPhone 13 Pro, I've had no issues with it, even in direct sunlight. It is a really nice screen. Whereas with the iPhone 14 Pro, as we said, it is a slightly different screen. It has a different cutout. What happens here is that the brightness, the high brightness mode, goes all the way up to 2000 nits. I need to test this out. It is still a 6.1 inch display, but what happens here is the resolution is just slightly higher. So it's 1179 pixels by 2556 pixels. So in terms of display performance, in my experience so far, they're much the same. The key thing is that obviously Apple has the dynamic island, which works with in software in certain conditions. So, for example, if you have notifications on in the background and you're playing music, what essentially happens is it starts playing the music. Let's just minimize this. And your music goes into a software overlay or extension of the pill that gives you music playing there. And you can do that with particular types of rich notifications, such as setting a timer. So let's try doing that. Essentially, they've made something to cover up and make that dynamic island useful. It's a bit like popping your security camera inside the bushes in front of your house. It makes it look a bit cool, it gives it a bit of functionality. Everyone knows it's there, but it's essentially making something out of something that could have been a detractor to the iPhone 14 Pro. And in everyday use, I'll really need to try this out. Let's try setting a timer, for example, for 32 minutes. We should have finished recording this video by the time that's done. There you go. So you've got a little timer there, and then it takes you quickly back to the app. Okay then, so we've touched on Dynamic Island, the slightly higher resolution, the slightly higher brightness on the display, according to Apple. What I would say is quite important to bear in mind is that despite those physical differences, the slightly bigger phone, apparently the bezels are slightly smaller. That's probably due to that notch reorganization and so forth. Now, in terms of software, both these devices, the iPhone 13 Pro and 14 Pro, are running iOS 16 now. The difference on the inside is that the chipset is different. So the iPhone 13 Pro introduced the Apple A15 Bionic chip. That was a 5nm chip. I've had no issues with it. It did everything I needed it to. I can't talk for benchmarks because I don't really think they're relevant. In terms of chip on the inside of the iPhone 14 Pro, it has an Apple A16 Bionic. That's a 4nm chipset. Just as with the iPhone 13 Pro and the A15 Bionic, it's a hexa-core chipset. That's 6 cores, and it has the Apple GPU. Apparently it's faster, according to Apple, but their stats and metrics are questionable at best, especially when they just talk about it being X times better, but not really telling you the context of how it is and what you can do better. Anyway, we've talked about the cameras. Whilst we're on the notch in the screen, both devices have a notch, and that contains not just your security or face unlock features, it also has the selfie camera. Both devices have a 12 megapixel camera. What is important here is that the iPhone 14 Pro seems to have autofocus there, which should make taking selfies better in certain conditions. Both are capable of recording 4K video, just the same as the back cameras, and they have gyro electronic image stabilization if you bump the resolution down to 1080p. Now, in terms of ports, at the bottom you have the Lightning port, that's for data, that's on the iPhone 13 Pro. Surprise, surprise, it's pretty much the same on the iPhone 14 Pro. It's Lightning. Now, the issue for me is that this means that you have USB 2 speeds for transferring video. If you're recording a long 4K video on your phone and you want to transfer it onto your PC, onto your Mac, it will take a long time. It's quite frustrating, especially with the sort of creator-centric video recording capabilities this device has. In terms of connectivity, they're both 5G devices. They both have Bluetooth 5, but specifically they have Bluetooth 5 on the iPhone 13 Pro. The iPhone 14 Pro has Bluetooth 5.3, so it's slightly better standard. It will be compatible with more modern devices. In terms of GPS or global positioning system, or I should say location services, both devices have quite a wide option for that. They start off with GPS and assisted GPS. They both connect to GLONASS. They both connect to Galileo, to BDS and QZSS, which I'm really not sure what it is, but it's on the spec sheet, so it must be important. They both have NFC, but you can't use it like NFC with any other smartphone. NFC in this case is locked down to what Apple allows you to use it for, which is pretty much just Apple Pay. And apart from that, that's pretty much everything. Both devices support Face ID, both devices have all the usual connectivity. The iPhone 14 Pro will have a service called Emergency SOS via satellite. Apple covered this in their keynote, but it may be something that it will take a while to arrive to Europe. They've announced that it will arrive in November for the US and Canada. We still don't know much about when it will come to Europe. One last point, which I did find a little frustrating with the iPhone 13 Pro, it only charges at 15 watts. It's not a fast charging device, despite Apple saying that it is. 15 watts is actually slower than the Google Pixel 6a, which is a bit of a downer. And the iPhone, in this case the iPhone 14 Pro, also has the same charging speed. So we'll need to see how that works out in everyday use. Both devices support MagSafe, magnetic wireless charging. So it does work, and you can see I've got the little charger there. It is quite a useful feature if you have something like this Journey wireless MagSafe charger. It really clicks in nicely to the back of the device and keeps that wireless charging in place. The same can be said for the iPhone 14 Pro. It is a nice feature and it works well. You'll need specialized cases to make sure you can use that if you are charging your phone wirelessly with a case on. And in terms of everything else, I think we've covered all the key features and specs. First impressions are that the color is really nice, this deep purple or deep purple rain. I quite like this. I'm not going to be too sad to say goodbye to the iPhone 13 Pro. I've used it for a year. It's not really very exciting to me. The cameras are okay, they're good, but they're nothing to wow me compared to similarly priced Android devices. I suppose if you're an iPhone user, this is amazing, but at the moment, my opinion, using both high-end Android devices and the iPhone 13 Pro, I get more out of devices like the Google Pixel 6 Pro, the Honor Magic 4 Pro, and so on. So let's say goodbye to the iPhone 13 Pro. We've covered a lot of accessories, gadgets, and the device itself on the Tech Travel Geeks YouTube channel. It's been an interesting journey, but it's time to say goodbye. So from now on, we'll be focusing on iPhone 14 Pro accessories, gadgets, services. I really want to delve into eSIM for travel here on the Tech Travel Geeks YouTube channel. So if you don't already, please do subscribe to the Tech Travel Geeks here on YouTube. We cover these devices as well as our travels and anything else we find interesting. For now, thanks for watching. If you have any further questions or comments, please do leave them in the section below. And for now, goodbye from me.